Watch PCN's coverage of Pennsylvania politics and policy, history and culture, sports, and more with the PCN app. Stream live events and video on demand in HD from your favorite device. Go to PCNTV.com to start streaming today.
Get a deeper understanding of Pennsylvania politics and policy with On the Issues. Watch Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. PCN, Pennsylvania Politics and Policy.
Join our guests for insights on issues impacting local government and the citizens of Pennsylvania. Created by the Pennsylvania State Association of Boroughs, Inside Pennsylvania Boroughs connects you to legislation and policy that will affect you and your family. Your host, Chris Kapp, and his guests discuss current affairs that matter to you most. Connect with your state by tuning into Inside Pennsylvania Boroughs on Sundays here on PCN.
My guest today is Greg Pickel. He covers Penn State football for Penn Live. Greg, this week, the Big Ten decided that they're not going to have a fall football season. Can you give us a little bit of information about how that decision was made?
Yeah, it's unprecedented. You know, Penn State's hosted a home football game every season since sometime in the late 1800s. So it is certainly going to be a weird fall in Happy Valley. There's no question about that. So the Big Ten presidents got together over the weekend and really started a push toward postponing the season to the spring. A lot of coaches, including Penn State's James Franklin, wanted to postpone that decision as opposed to postponing the season at this point in time. Their argument was we should get more information. We should find out more about what medical experts think, and we should give ourselves time for more testing capabilities to become available. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of talk of late about the unknown and the uncertainties, as Big Ten Commissioner Kevin Warren put it, about the coronavirus, and the fact that we don't know how long-term what long-term impacts there are, and we don't know about this heart condition that's really popped up in some athletes in the Big Ten. So you put all that stuff together, and despite the best effort from the players who obviously said they want to play, and the coaches who said we'll fight for our players, the Big Ten voted on Tuesday to postpone the season until the spring. They put out a news release, and some teams threatened to either leave the Big Ten or go play a schedule by themselves. They have all backed down now because nobody wants to walk away from that $51 million that the conference distributes each and every year. So obviously disappointing for a lot of people, but we are in the middle of a pandemic, and I think most of us could at least envision a scenario where this happened. It just happened, I think, a little bit earlier than most expected.
Now, has been some talks about the spring season. Obviously, it's still early. Do we have any idea what kind of details, what that looks like?
Yeah, so unfortunately, one of the things that really popped out about all this is that the leadership at the Big Ten level is not great at the moment. We've heard repeatedly from Penn State Athletic Director Sandy Barber and from others that, you know, they weren't really looking at a spring season. They weren't really planning for it. They continuously called it a last resort. And the problem is they've known since March that this was a possibility. So to not have any infrastructure in place to move to a spring season, or at least present the idea of a spring season, was a bit troubling. But, you know, they are working on that now. There's been talks about starting what we would typically have summer camp practices. It would be winter camp practices, I guess, in December, and then start the season in early January. There's also talk about starting those camp practices in January and then playing in February. Now, obviously, in Big Ten country here and elsewhere, it gets very cold. So there's this idea of playing in domes, be it in Milwaukee or Minneapolis or Detroit or Syracuse, even perhaps as far as St. Louis. There are enough domes in the Big Ten footprint, I think, to create a bubble-like atmosphere where you could take, say, 6 teams to one location and 6 teams to another, or 7 and 7, or however you want to break it up. And it seems like that's the only way you could do this. So they're starting to work on those plans now. Purdue coach Jeff Brown's really been a leader in that regard, and we'll see what they come up with. But they have a lot of other questions to figure out as well.
Well, the Big Ten making this decision, the Pac-12 has also decided to cancel their season. But if you're a Pitt fan right now, the ACC is still ready to go. The SEC is still planning to play football games. Is that going to stay the same? Are we going to get a season for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one that specific to Penn State and Ohio State and Michigan and some other schools in the Big Ten, they wish they were in the same position right now where it's not a guarantee that they play, but at least they still have the opportunity to, and at least they still have the chance to evaluate things. And, the Pac-12 Medical Advisory Committee put out a very detailed explanation about why they decided to cancel. Postpone. The Big Ten did not. So while we can assume they were on the same page, we don't know that at this time. But as it relates to the ACC, the head of that medical advisory board, a doctor at Duke, said it is safe to play football. As long as you do X, Y, and Z, it is safe. And that's why the ACC and the SEC continue to move on. So I believe the ACC is set for a mid-September start. The SEC will start on the last weekend of September. I'd be really surprised at this point if they didn't at least start the season. Now, I'm not sure they're going to finish it, but I do think they'll at least start it. So I do think college football fans will have some games to watch this fall. Who knows how long it'll last, but I do think we'll have something to watch for sure.
Well, those games really rely on the players, and there's been a lot of talk about sending kids back to college anyways, concerns about having that many young people around each other. Anybody who's been to a college campus knows what happens on a college campus.
Right.
So what precautions are being taken by student athletes if they do end up playing these games?
Yeah, so one of the things we've seen a lot of is double face shields. So, you've seen mostly NFL players, some college player wear eye visors, and they've basically made one that goes over your mouth as well, and it covers basically the entirety of your face, so that way you're not either spitting on somebody or, something along those lines, spreading any fluids through your mouth and nose, which we know is a way that the coronavirus can be transmitted. So that's been one thing. Obviously, masks have been worn when the helmets are off. We've seen social distancing going on as best we can. But ultimately, the one problem that a lot of people have run into and talked about is you can do all of these coronavirus mitigation things in practice pretty easily. And with your own team, it becomes an extreme challenge when you're trying to do that with another team. And you can't socially distance when you have to tackle somebody, or when there's a fumble and everyone dives for it, or when the offensive lineman tries to block the defensive lineman. So that's really what was a concern for a lot of people. And, again, it's interesting that you have some doctors and some conferences saying we can do this safely, and then some conferences and doctors say, no, we can't. But at the end of the day, the Big Ten, the Pac-12 decided to move first. We'll see if they end up being on the right side of this, or if the SEC and the ACC do get to start. I think they will.
Well, presuming that we do get a spring season, how does this change the calculus for student athletes? How the preparation coming into a fall, it's a normal schedule. Now you're doing workouts in the middle of winter. Is there some kind of a level of concern about the athletes about how that's going to work?
Yeah, I think at this point, most of them just want to play, but there will be concerns about playing, how many games do they play in the spring versus when does the next fall season start? If there is a spring season, and let's keep in mind it's spring, we keep hearing spring season, it's spring semester because they're going to start in January in the wintertime. But, if they play, I mentioned Purdue's Jeff Brom earlier. His idea would be to play an 8-game schedule in the spring and a 10-game schedule in the fall that would start in October or late September. And I think that makes a lot of sense. The team that goes to the college football playoff, the championship game, usually plays 15 games anyway. And then 2 weeks after that game, they start lifting and working out and conditioning towards spring practice. So, there's been a lot of talk, former Ohio State coach Urban Meyer saying there's no chance for spring football. I think there is, because these kids are doing a lot more work and workouts and practicing than a lot of people realize. And, you'd have to take some contact away from other parts of the year, especially the summer, if you did that. But I think the kids want to play. I think the coaches want to play. Well, you have guys opt out, just like Penn State's Micah Parsons already has. Yeah, of course. But you'll have enough players who want to play and coaches who want to do it, and medical people willing to put in the work to find the science that, supports that and make sure they do it as safely and as in a healthy way as possible. So I think they'll find a way to do it, yes.
You mentioned Micah Parsons, notably opted out of the season before it was postponed. But he's potentially a first-round draft prospect moving into the next NFL draft. How does the postponed, semi-canceled season affect the NFL draft? How does it affect guys who are on the bubble?
Yeah, so they have a lot to figure out right now because the NFL and the NFL Players Association will probably have to negotiate some kind of agreement to possibly move the draft if there is a spring season. If not, it'll be as is. But when you talk about the opt-outs, a lot of guys who are first round, second round, third round picks are projected to be for the NFL draft. They might not play a spring season, especially if that spring season is going to end or even maybe overlap with when the NFL draft is, because they're just not going to want to risk the injury. So I don't think Micah Parsons is the last Penn State player to opt out. Tight end Pat Freiermuth is a guy who has been adamant that he wants to play one more season in college. He's also a guy who's a surefire first-round pick, and it might not be worth the risk for him to play this spring. So we'll see what he decides. There's some other guys on the roster in the same boat. It will be – if there's a spring season, there will be some depleted rosters, no question. But that's why they get 85 scholarship guys, and they bring in recruits. Penn State signed one of its largest classes in history that will join the program between next January and next August. So there'll be some depleted rosters, but there'll be plenty of talent to play if that ends up being the case. But you will see some guys opt out for sure.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up scholarships and recruiting, because that gets into my next question about, the coronavirus has impacted not just the actual playing of college football, but the recruiting, the bringing people into the fold to play future season. How has COVID affected the recruiting process?
Right. So usually you'd see a lot of kids on campus in the spring. You'd see them there for most of the summer, and they would be planning official visits or unofficial visits. And the difference there is official visits are ones the school pays for, and unofficial visits are ones the kids and their family have to pay for. But they'd be planning those for the fall. And, of course, that's not going to happen this year. We have not seen any college football program host a recruit since all the shutdowns started back in the middle of March. That's going to continue through at least September 30th because the NCAA has extended a dead period, which means the only contact coaches and recruits can have is via the phone or electronic means. They cannot be in person. So there's not a lot going on in terms of in-person visits. Now, if you're a recruit and you and your family want to drive to State College or Columbus or Ann Arbor or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, whatever, you can do that. You just can't have any interaction with the coaches. So we've seen a couple of those things happen. But yeah, it's really changed the game, especially the evaluation portion of it. A lot of kids, especially seniors, and not just in the sport of football, would go to camps in the summer to try and showcase their abilities to maybe earn a scholarship or a chance to play at that level. And they, of course, haven't had that opportunity. So everything's online, everything's via video now, and it has been a game changer. There's no doubt about that. And who knows when anybody will host recruits again. It'll probably still be a few months.
Well, it sounds like we're heading into murky territory for college football. Greg, thank you so much for joining me. My guest has been Greg Pickel. He is the PSU football correspondent for Penn Live.
Thank you.
The eyes of the nation are on Pennsylvania as a key influencer to the 2020 election. PCN has over 25 years of trusted state government coverage. Our network is your platform to connect directly with Pennsylvania voters. Whether it's a presidential race, statewide campaign, or local cause, our viewers are ready to hear from you. Book your ad now. PCN, your access to Pennsylvania voters.
My guest is Rick Roush. He's the Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State University. Rick, Penn State is coming back to school on August 24th. How is the College of Agricultural Sciences dealing with COVID-19 this year?
Well, like the rest of the university, we're designing our teaching so that it can be done remotely as well as in person. Over half of our classes will have at least some face-to-face presence so the instructors and students can interact directly, particularly courses that include laboratories and field trips. But more broadly than that, we're carrying a significant role for the whole university in doing surveillance monitoring of the frequency of COVID in the university community. We're doing this by three different means. One is to monitor for COVID in the wastewater stream, which is a tactic being used around the world because a lot of virus gets shed through human waste as well as through the air. So that's being run out of our agricultural biological engineering department. And second, the university is going to be surveillance sampling people every workday with swabs and so forth, students and faculty and staff who are on campus. And we're running the analysis on those for the University Health Services and trying to help identify people who might have it, as well as getting an idea of what the frequency is in the university population. And the third tactic is fairly novel, that there's a lot of research increasingly available that shows a very early and important diagnostic symptom is the loss of taste, sense of smell and taste. And we'll be both publicizing how the people should be aware of this, and with things like smell the coffee in the morning, just, can you still smell? But also doing smell testing by rub and sniff cards, so that we can test people directly and find out what kinds of, have they lost any sense of smell for particular smells and so forth. So we're looking to combine all these measures to try to get a good idea of whether the frequency of COVID is increasing or declining in the population on campus.
Do you feel pretty confident in the measures being taken, or classes going to continue all fall?
Yeah, it's really going to depend on what happens with the load that the students bring in, but we've got some pretty rigorous standards in place, and there's no guarantees in anything, but we're pretty confident that we can. The aim is to continue doing in-person on-campus delivery up to Thanksgiving, and then after that, the students will leave. There won't be any face-to-face courses after Thanksgiving holidays.
Well, moving on to a different note here, Ag Progress Day is pretty well known in State College this time of year, but it was held virtually. And if you watched PCN this weekend, you may have noticed some virtual recordings. How did that go? How has everything been accomplished?
Well, this was a really tough question for the college. In fact, we sort of made our decision after the Center County Grange Fair decided it wouldn't be in person this year either. But we thought about it for quite a long while and realized it just wasn't very practical to do, but we still want to try to serve the agricultural community as much as possible. So the Ag Progress Days manager decided to go ahead and try to do as many of these things virtually as possible. And we all organized various things. So, and I think they were very successful. Secretary Redding and I had a town hall, which we always have on site. And typically when on site, we'll have about 25 or 40 people in the room. We had over 200, at one point, I think 250 people were logged on to watch it when we did virtually, which I think suggests that people are interested in this, especially if we can make it more easily accessible across the state. So that was really good. So Jesse Darlington manages our Progress Days farm. I think one of the things we'll contemplate next year is trying to do, even if we can bring the farm back, the Ag Progress Days back fully in person, that we'll probably want to try to maintain a lot of the virtual components of the program, because it has the potential to reach out to people far more than could actually get to Ag Progress Days in person.
Well, you and Secretary Redding during that town hall had a pretty wide discussion, but one of the things that you discussed was some of the lessons learned in the agricultural community from COVID-19. What are some of those issues that really stand out to you?
Well, one of the first, and we all started to become aware of the challenges that meat packing plants are having, particularly Smithfield in South Dakota and others that were quite famous. But the next thing that sort of caught my attention was that there were photos of large piles of fruits and vegetables in Florida that were just being dumped because they couldn't get to markets. And it focused attention on the fact that, something approaching half our food supply goes to restaurants and cruise ships and hospitals and so forth. And those markets just disappeared overnight. So that sort of alerted us that we needed to go out and start making connections with the fruit and vegetable industry in Pennsylvania. By the time we got started on this, the challenges were already readily apparent for the meat industry, and they were trying to figure out ways of changing large packaging and delivering small packaging and so forth. But we realized the same sort of thing must be happening with people in fruit and vegetables. So we got together with a lot of the sort of representatives or organizations we regularly deal with, in the fruit growers and vegetable growers, canners and so forth. And we had a meeting, virtually of course, we had a meeting to sort of talk with them about what the challenges were, what was going on. And collectively, what you see out of this is there are two places where things go wrong in the food supply chain. One is at the end when the markets disappear, as evidenced by these fruit piles in Florida, but also as evidenced by what was happening in meatpacking plants. that you could have interruptions in the middle of the food chain because the workers are getting sick. So we were looking at the same thing in the vegetable industry. They didn't have the same level of concentration, so but they were picking up cases of people coming down ill. One of the things I did is I asked our agricultural economists, particularly Stefan Getz and Claudia Schmidt, to try to look at what this issue might be in terms of supply chain, which they study for the fruit and vegetable industry. And they did a very comprehensive analysis, including looking at the demography, what was happening in the populations of around our fruit and vegetable growing areas, and realized that the challenge there was that people, because these areas are close to Philadelphia and so forth, workers were picking up COVID just by community spread, and so they came with a significant COVID issue to the workplace and to markets and so forth already. And part of our challenge was how to address that, identify where the biggest areas would be. So throughout that, as Extension has done many other things, it pivoted, and a lot of work was being done in terms of how people would address this. So the collaborations included, they work with health groups, the Department of Agriculture, agricultural employee health providers, Penn State law, which helped advise us about the legal ramifications of various aspects of this, fruit and vegetable growers themselves, and we developed and printed pamphlets and posters, both in English and Spanish, about COVID implications and how to avoid coming down with it, and distributing them quite widely. So, I mean, there are things we learned during this you would never have imagined. So, because the large institutional cans were no longer viable, the canners had to shift to using smaller cans. And who would have thought in January or February they needed to order a lot more materials to make small cans? But that turned out to be one of their limiting factors, that they wanted to move more product in the consumer market, but didn't have the cans for it for a while. So I think some of the things we've learned about this is there's to plan a lot more about being robust about this. And also one of the things we emphasized was that for people who were moving to markets, have plans B, C, and D about what your marketing are going to be. If you primarily focus on institutional markets and so forth, maybe you should shift a lot more and look at some of the small local markets, which our, particularly Claudia Schmidt was able to try to help identify for people so they could shift where the product was going with the changing nature of what the market opportunities were.
Considering the nature of the market, we have a kind of just-in-time system where things move from point A to point B. That's going to be really difficult to change in just a couple of months. And as much as we might want to shift local, it's just logistically difficult to do. As we move into the fall and into the winter, the COVID concerns will return. Are there any short-term things that are being done right now to help alleviate the kind of supply issues we saw?
I think so. I mean, moving into winter, winter in particular for Pennsylvania, a lot of food imports are coming from outside the state, California and the like. But I think there's an increased awareness that people have to be flexible and nimble in how they're trying to move things. There's some California producers I've read about, for example, that just routinely have some part of their production going institutional, some going into local markets, some going into farmers markets and so forth. So they, just as a routine matter, they've hedged their bets by looking to have, not relying on one market opportunity alone, but diversifying a bit. And so I think there's some lessons there. This was something people in California were just doing routinely because of the nature of fluctuations in the market. But it certainly says something about, looking at your options, keep your options open, that if your usual suppliers can't be used, having plans in place to quickly divert to more local market opportunities.
What would that kind of backup system, moving food to local systems, look like? Is it just a matter of not sending as much to a different state, or is it more complex than that?
Well, it probably is a little more complex than that, but a lot of what we were trying to do is just make sure that there were resources available that identified what the local food networks were. What were the ways that you could get into local markets that were necessarily parts of big chains, but also farmers markets and the like, so that if you had to, you could divert into some of the local market opportunities quickly.
Well, that's all the time we have. Rick Roush, who's the Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State University. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Morgan. It's a pleasure.
This Sunday on the African American Experience.
And it was quite surprising to find out that I had an ancestor, at least one, that served in the Civil War and that fought for the Union, and he had things. He had emancipated himself.
We're joined today by Elizabeth Bolden. She serves as President and CEO of the Pennsylvania Commission for Community Colleges. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Francine.
As students are preparing to return to the fall semester of college, what advantages do you see community colleges having over traditional four-year schools?
Well, I think anytime that a student decides to pursue their post-secondary path, it's a good thing. And particularly in these very unsettling times where we are merging to remote instruction, I think students can benefit from the expertise in community colleges in this space. Community colleges, even before COVID-19, had about 175 programs that could have been completed entirely online. And that's helpful as we scale those programs across the state with faculty teaching other faculty. The learning curve was not as significant as it might have been for programs that had never been operating in the online space. Additionally, community colleges are a tremendous value because we are public institutions in the Commonwealth. Our tuition is the most affordable in the state. On average, an individual can take a year of community colleges coursework for about $4,200. That varies, of course, by specific institution and by a program that a student might be enrolled in. But that is more than half as much as some of our other post-secondary institutions in the Commonwealth. So particularly in this time where students' financial situations may have been disrupted or they're concerned about the finances for the future because their family has experienced financial change in jobs, community colleges could be a very appealing option that could allow students to continue on their post-secondary journey without incurring additional amounts of student debt.
How prevalent are community colleges throughout Pennsylvania?
So community colleges, there are only 14 colleges, but they operate more than 100 sites and programs throughout the Commonwealth. In addition, they do have a broad array of online options. So every individual in the Commonwealth, whether you live in the proximity of a community college or not, is close to community college programming. And anyone can find out where their nearest community college is by visiting our website at www.pacommunitycolleges.org.
How has the coronavirus pandemic affected the schools that you represent in a financial aspect?
So community colleges have been impacted much like the rest of our society. Since the pandemic first caused the shutting down of higher education institutions, the colleges have lost significant amounts of revenue in addition to incurring costs for the shift to completely remote learning. As I mentioned before, this was something that community colleges were familiar with doing, but not to the scale that has been required now that campuses have shut down their physical locations. Faculty have done a remarkable job in shifting all of their instruction, including some instruction that one would not normally assume could be taken online, into a remote format. In addition, those community colleges that are in regions that have been deemed safe to reopen are, of course, incurring costs associated with cleaning, disinfecting, installing plexiglass shields, and new signage for students so that they are aware of where they can move safely at their campuses during this reopening. So the costs continue to rise. We estimate as of mid-July, those costs totaled about $100 million. And so we are anxiously awaiting for federal and state support to help the colleges deal with those revenue losses and increased costs.
Do you anticipate that as a result of these increased costs, that increases may also occur in future tuition rates?
Well, we are going to do everything we can to not increase tuition. At community colleges, making sure that our education is affordable is a priority. And so we will be doing everything that we can to ensure that the costs are not passed along to students. We were the recipient of some funds during the first federal stimulus package known as the CARES Act. Half of the funds we received were distributed to our students, and that was a good thing. We know that our students need these funds for emergency costs associated with the pandemic, whether it be they needed housing assistance, assistance with internet, to pay for the cost of internet for the remote classes. And last week, the governor did release $6.5 million of the governor's gear fund to help community colleges with things like cleaning, disinfecting, testing, and temperature taking. So the federal and state funds are starting to flow to the colleges, and that will be really important in allowing us to move forward and continue fulfilling our public mission in these very, very trying times.
Particularly in this time of so much uncertainty, can you talk a little bit about the general admission and application policies of community colleges and how those compare to traditional four-year schools?
So in general, community college admission process is much more flexible than some other sectors of higher education because that is our statutory mission. So the good news is whether you are 12 or 52, you are eligible to enroll in your local community college. Community colleges do not require anything other than that you be a resident of Pennsylvania, and you can enroll in our classes if it has been a long time since you have if you have enrolled in higher education. Community colleges have courses and programs to get you up to speed. There's no GPA requirement and no SAT score. And so I encourage folks to not be concerned about that. Additionally, community colleges have a number of start dates. So if you still have not decided whether or not you want to pursue post-secondary education in the fall of 2020, it is not too late to call a community college and ask if you can participate in one of the many programs that they have. And additionally, if you are a student who has had financial disruption in your family circumstances, I think the best thing all students can do is call the financial aid office of their college or university and explain their situation and ask if it is possible for any adjustments to be made in their financial aid package so that they can continue making progress on their post-secondary goals.
What do enrollment rates look like this fall?
So enrollment is down, although it continues to trend up every week. And I think that is a function of students being reluctant to make a decision in these very uncertain times. Over the summer, our enrollment was even over last summer at this time. So generally, community college enrollment does tend to increase in times of economic uncertainty because people realize that the jobs that they had hoped to return to either won't exist or they need different skills or training. And really, community colleges are the best place to receive new skill training or to upskill because we are the responsive, flexible education option that allows businesses to work with community colleges to ensure that our curriculum is aligned with what the workplace needs so that students can leave community college and seamlessly transfer into employment.
One common concern that students may have is that they may take college credits from a community college and they're concerned whether or not those would transfer to a four-year school. How do you respond to that?
Well, Francine, I do know that many students are concerned about that. And I would say in response to that community college credit is college credit. And particularly if students are considering transferring between one of the Pennsylvania's 14 community colleges and one of our PASHE institutions, there is a process called TAOC and program-to-program agreements, which allow your credits to transfer seamlessly from a community college to a PASHE institution with no loss of credit or time to degree. In addition, we have hundreds of agreements with private colleges and universities in Pennsylvania that are eager to accept community college students. And they also have their own articulation agreement, which allows students to transfer all 60 of their credits to the baccalaureate degree granting institution, and they don't have to retake courses, spending time and money learning content that they already have. And information about all of those transfer agreements can be found from your local community college, and they can help students chart that pathway to ensure that they're not losing time or credit on their way to attaining their degree.
Roughly about a week ago, the Tribune Review published an editorial, and one of their suggestions was that state system schools perhaps redesign some of their school formats into a community college system. What do you think about that proposal?
Well, I think that the Commonwealth has a statute in place to determine what is the best way to establish a new community college. We just went through that process in Pennsylvania with the establishment of the Erie Community College. In the statute, it requires that entities that want to establish a community college present that information to the State Board of Education, which reviews it, and then there is a vote to determine not only does it if it meets the statutory requirements, but if there is sufficient funding. And I think that that is a good process. It has served the Commonwealth well for the 50 years that it has been in place, and it seems like a reasonable approach moving forward.
How do member schools determine whether to return to conducting classes in person versus online?
So every community college will follow CDC, Department of Education, and Department of Health guidelines to determine whether it's safe to reopen. And that is based on a number of factors, including if they have the space to ensure that students can safely return while observing social distancing, whether they have the resources to ensure faculty and staff are safe when they return. And so we have had a return of some programs that require in-person instruction or assessment in those limited areas, such as some medical fields, firefighting, emergency services. And those are being done in accordance with the best practices we know to keep everyone on our campuses safe. And that will continue through this phase of the pandemic. We understand that everyone wants to be back on campus. Higher education is a collaborative experience, and we will proceed with that when it is safe to do so.
During this unprecedented time, what is your personal outlook on what the future of community college will look like and whether they're positioned to operate not only during this pandemic, but also in the future?
So I think that community colleges will continue to be important, and even more so as people realize that we are going to be entering a very different time in the future. Some of the things that we were accustomed to doing will no longer be things that we do. So we will have an increased need for data scientists and folks who can look at data, cybersecurity, emergency services, healthcare workers. We know that we're seeing an increased rate of retirement among healthcare workers. Community colleges are historically the place that people have learned those skills. Community colleges train 75% of the RNs that work in the Commonwealth. Those are fields that are going to continue to be important in driving Pennsylvania's economy, and therefore community colleges will continue to be important, not just because they provide the most affordable way for a student to get a degree, but because they also offer that workforce training that individuals are going to need in order to participate in a post-COVID economy, and that Pennsylvania is going to need if our state is to have a thriving economy post-COVID-19.
Elizabeth Bolden serves as president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Commission for Community Colleges. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Francine.
This Sunday on It's History.
As his family began to expand, so did the house. And what he did was he actually built around the trading post and connected parts of the house. That was the original part of the house, built in the